I think it's fair to say that the Verbos random sampling is the module in the Verbos range that confuses the most people. I thought the voltage multistage sequence selector combo was the one, but I get the most question about the random sampling. I think, however, that it's a very legible random module. It's very clearly labeled and designed, and you always know what's going on with the LEDs. The two top parts are fluctuating randoms. You can move the rate with a knob or with CV. It goes from very, very slow, very sloth, torpor-like, to very, very high, which turns the signal to an audio signal, a sort of noise. And if you go from very slow to very high with CV, with an envelope, for example, it will give you percussive sounds like snares or hi-hats. It's interesting to note that the fluctuating random and the gates are completely unrelated. So it doesn't mean that because the fluctuating random is high, that you will get a gate. It's just completely different. Both are true random. So you have two of that, which can be really, really useful. You can mix them, you can send them everywhere with notes. I love those parts. The fluctuating random are clearly what I prefer about this module. Then you get a quantized random. So to this one, you have to send a clock in the trigger input. I'm sending a division of my clock, and you have two different algorithms. So basically, it samples these two, or maybe just one of those, I'm not sure, and it gives you different results. This knob will change the probability of the CV being high, the number of bits, so between 1 and 6. It doesn't mean that if it's at 1, you won't get only ones. You will get more of ones, but you will still get some 6 at some times. And inversely, if it's at 6, you will get a lot of higher values, but you will still get low values. So it's very nice to have CV control over that. These two are also very musical. Since they are quantized, you can send them trigger along with your sequence, and you can sometimes mix it with a CV sequence to add some random notes. It's not quantized in the sense of a quantizer with notes. It's just the quantization means along with the clock. It won't give you like a major scale out of this. It's just not the way it works. Then, what is probably the thing that confuses the most people about this module is the analog shift register. Similarly to the quantized random part, you have to send it a trigger. Once again, I'm sending it a division of my clock. And to have it work, you have to send a CV input. I'm sending it a SO LFO from Batumi. If you take it out, then it will advance, but there's nothing at the CV input, so there won't be any output. Basically, this is a sample and hold. You put something inside, you trigger it, and then it gives you something out. But there are 4 of those, and they are cascading. So 1, if you plug this here, you will get a different values every time the trigger hits. So this one will get the new value, and we pass the value along to the next one. You don't have to use it as an analog shift register, which means 4 cascading sample and holds. You can use it just one if you want. And then that's basically a sample and hold, or just 2. So it's just a simple cascading sample and hold, but with only 2 values. So you can use this as 4 sample and hold, just 1 sample and hold, whatever you like. You can put different triggers, you can put different inputs. You can put different inputs, but just 1 trigger. You can do everything you like. It's very, very powerful. The last part is the noise source. I guess this is probably the most easy to understand part. White noise, pink noise, and metallic noise, which is a bunch of detuned square waves, very, very similar to the symbol in the 808. Very, very useful to create soundscapes, but also, of course, percussive sounds. Okay, so let's start with probably the least clever or interesting way to use the random sampling, but if I'm being honest, the way I use it the most is just to use the fluctuating random, that is the two top parts, to modulate a parameter, and really that's the extent of it. Why do I really like these two to modulate stuff? There's a sweet spot where it's not too slow, not too fast, where the modulation can really, in a subtle way, breathe life into your tracks, into your modulation, move a filter. And what I really like to do is basically give the rein to the random sampling to choose how my track is gonna evolve, really. So you find the right speed that works with the speed of your track, and really if you use, let's take an obvious use, and when I'm gonna showcase here, like you use the fluctuating random to open a filter, well, when the filter is opening, you can bring another elements like hats, and etc. When it's closing, you can remove an element. Really just follow along the random just to create tension in your track. And I like not really choosing. I choose the rate, I choose the parameter, I choose how much I modulate, but then it's just the random who does the job. And it's smooth in a way that I think works much better than the LFO, which is in, out, in, out. Of course, you can mix LFOs, but I also really like that it's only positive. Let's take an example. I have this very super basic sequence, which is the dual sine sawtooth generator into amplitude and tone controller, which isn't modulated. There's just an envelope opening it. And then it's going into the filter 8, which is in a low pass mode. And so I close it where basically the sound is barely audible, especially when there's the other elements. And I'm sending the fluctuating random into the exponential FM input. And so it's rather slow, and it moves and opens the sound. And like I said, I just follow along. Of course, nothing stops you from mixing this signal with something else, something more rhythmic if you want, an envelope, any other form of CV you have. But really, most of the time I find myself just using it by itself. I find it really musical. It's just the kind of random I prefer. makes the most simple sequence tolerable for a very long time. It helps to have a good sounding filter. Nice reverb. But that's it. Okay, let's try to find something a bit more complicated to do with this. For anyone wondering what this big nest of cable is, it's a Krell Patch. If you're wondering what a Krell Patch is, what are you doing in front of a Buchla-inspired random module demo? Well, to be honest, I never did a Krell Patch before, and Krell Patches are really like the cliche modular thing to do. They can be amazing, but really when people that are used to working in the DAW or with electron boxes think about modular, what they think about is a video in poor audio quality going blah, 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 blah. So yeah, that's a Krell Patch. What I've been trying to do here is to turn that into something useful, because what I just tried to describe with my tongue wasn't very musical. It's also a good reminder that anything goes with techno, and that if you have a good driving beat, you can almost get away with everything. So Krell Patch. At the heart of a Krell Patch is a cycling envelope. Anything that resemble math, function, contour 1, rampage, everything works. Basically, you need cycle button, you need rise and fall, controllable with CV, and you need, of course, a random module, which brings us to the random module. And that's where all the patch originate. I've patched everything, the whole analog shift register, both quantized random, I've doubled them everywhere. The slew randoms are also moving the fall and rise of function. And I also multed some of the outputs through a buff mult to go into the pitch, into the rise and fall, into the slew. And I've taken the results of this, the audio from the complex oscillator, which is modulated volt and octave and all the harmonic section with the random sampling. So this is going into an LXD, because what's more Buchla than an LPG? Then it's going into the filter 8 in bandpass mode, which is itself, of course, modulated randomly by the random sampling. And to add more spice, I've run that into the bark filter processor, of course, modulated by the random sampling. And the Kameniec, which you'll be amazed to hear, isn't modulated by the random sampling, but by a resulting follower of the bark filter processor through the sequence selector. So I'm not going to explain where every cable goes. There are plenty of videos about making a Krell Patch. I've just watched one 5 minutes ago because I didn't know how to do it. I never did one before. But yeah, I wanted to try and see if I can put this very experimental patch into something that I'm more familiar with. So I have a beat going with the recently acquired Octatrack, which is probably samples from some of my tracks I've put in there. And I'll just slap this resulted Krell Patch on it and see if it works. Oh, one thing I haven't done. Normally in a Krell Patch, to be very random, the heart of it must be the cycling envelope. But it's a bit too random to work. So instead of having it in cycle, I'm triggering it with the division of my clock. So that's the result. I think you'll agree it's still plenty random. But really that's the kind of patch that you need to be recording constantly. And especially if you have a sampler, you'll get crazy nuggets of sounds in there. You can hear the very vocal tones. And honestly, so far, I've heard sound I've never heard from my system, and I think I'm gonna dig this one further and try to narrow it down and really just sample away. So that's my Krell Patch. It's pretty basic. We'll tweak it a little, have more sound coming out, and let's bring the beat. I think the bark filter LEDs are quite helpful to see how things are moving. Ooh, sweet. Of course, you took one thing, and since everything is kind of linked together, it's gonna just change everything. I've resisted from the urge of patching the multi-delay processor, but it could have been interesting. Honestly, I think it's really fun to do. Not everything is working, but it's worth trying. Probably a good idea to slap some kind of compressor on this, because the sounds can be widely different in energy. Of course, I went overboard with the bark filter, but any filter, any delay, any effect you have will just work. Let's go back in subwater territories. This is really the definition as throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. Definitely gonna chop that. What? If, like me, you're making music based on rhythm, you may wonder how you can use these gate outputs on the fluctuating random section. They are related to the fluctuating random just by the fluctuation rate, that knob, but they are totally unrelated to the fluctuation CV output. So the speed is somewhat related, but like I said before, It's not because one is high that the other one will be high. It's just totally different outputs. These are not clockable, it's just output gates randomly. And sometimes if you're clocking an envelope with this, and it will be really out of time and hard to just make it work within your track. So 2 ways I found that you can make this work a bit better. So one way I've showcased here, which I'll explain in a minute, and another very simple use is to just mix a more steady clock, either the output of a small sequencer like that, or just a division of your clock from a clock divider. And you can mix that with a sort of gate here that's completely random, maybe a slow one, and then you can use that mix of a steady clock and random to advance a sequencer, or my favorite use of this is to use this with the sequence selector. So it will mainly advance with the clock, but it will sometimes like skip or go forward a bit faster because of the random gate. So that's a simple use, but something that can be useful and make your modulation seem a bit less repeatable. So this patch, actually I was doing research on how to use this, and I came across a very long interview between DivKid and Mark Verbos. I think it's very interesting, lots of good patch ideas in there. So if you're interested in the module, I'll link the video below. The idea is to take the random gate output and to put it through the analog shift register. The gate is the input here, and we advance the analog shift register with a gate or trigger. That's a division of my clock, division by 2. The analog shift register will only grab a gate when the clock hits. So it turns a random event into something that's on the grid. Like you see, it's happening only sometimes and not all of the time, which is exactly what we want. Let's hear this. I've used the gates to strike the LXD, in which I'm feeding the 158. And as you see, I'm using 3 outputs. So one is a gate for strike, one is a gate for function, for an envelope, and the third one is again a gate for strike. I'm striking and sending an envelope to LXD 3 times. I'm mixing the 2 gates in a add 2 from General Analog to go into 1 strike input. It sort of makes a delay sound because the strikes are delayed by the clock division by 2 of my main clock. So let's hear this. It will only happen when the green lights are on. I find this is very nice technique to make short stabs, bursts of sounds. You need to have something a bit more recurrent to happen, but you could probably build something a bit more consistent out of this. But so far, in the few examples I've tried, I really liked doing sparse sounds like this. And so I didn't stop here. I've used other outputs for modulation. So my 158 is going into LXD, back into the filter. I've modulated the filter with a simple LFO from Batumi, but I'm also using the quite fast CV from my gate here to modulate the filter as well. I'm just going through a quadrupole because I'm going to the volt per octave input, and this one doesn't have an attenuator. Would be a bit too much like this. It's almost audio rate modulation, as you can see. Not audio rate, but close. So my filter is going straight into my mixer, and I've used also the quantized output here to modulate the fall of function, and the other CV fluctuating one to modulate the rise of my envelope. So a bit like the Krell Patch we did before, we'll just have an envelope that's never quite repeating. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long. Of course, I can tweak the parameters, make it longer myself. And that's a lot of modulation for such a small burst of sound, but I think it's quite nice. Also, the oscillator, it's a dual oscillator, as you know, but it doesn't have the modulation matrix the complex oscillator has. So if I want to modulate this oscillator with this one, or inversely, I need to patch this one to that one. But in this case, I wanted a VCA in between to control the amount of modulation. So I'm going again through the quadrupole, and I'm using, again, one of the outputs of the quantized random to modulate the amount of modulation going from one oscillator to the other. So that's how I'm using the random sampling here. It's quite complicated patch for short bursts of sound, but it makes for a very nice alien sound. Of course, as you can hear, it's going into an eventide pedal. And cool thing with this short burst of sound, if you can very go to town with plugins and whatever, it's fun to experiment. So here I'm also throwing some pitch shifting, just activating it now. That's a nice sound, but that doesn't really make a track. So let's patch a bass line with Odessa sequenced by the Surge sequencer. And let's add some percussion now. And now our first sound gives some very spacey vibes in context. And then of course you can also tweak all these parameters, the envelope, the amount of modulation you're sending one oscillator to the other, the amount of modulation I'm sending from the random sampling to the filter 8. It's sort of an automated patch, but you have every parameter that's available to tweak. Odessa receives some modulation from Batumi in the wrap and density section, the com section. It's a very simple sequence. So yeah, that was one of the ideas I found to use these random crazy gates and make something a bit more rhythmic with it. I've realized that although my clock is quite fast and my random gates are quite fast, you really need to have a quite fast fluctuation rate to have some events happen, because this is true random. So for the true random to really happen on the right on the gate of here, well, there isn't that many chances. Even when you put an audio rate, it doesn't happen all of the time. Okay, I want to make a little percussive patch with the noise outputs of the random sampling. I think many people will use that way. The noise outs, they are really useful. White, pink and metallic, all very strong and powerful and good sounding. I think it's useful to have such powerful noise sources, especially since they are like 2 centimeters away from 4 sample and holds. So you can always sample the white noise, sample the pink noise, sample the metallic noise, or every one of them. But you can also use them as sound sources for percussive sounds. So I've used the white noise first as a simple hi-hat. Oops, not the one, that one. So super basic hi-hat. It's going into little reverb, I think. But other than that, very static. This is my bin sac triggering the multi-envelope, triggering quadruple mixer VCA. And this is going straight into the scan and pan. But I've plugged an input into the decay of my envelope. And so in the sequence selector, I've mixed the CVB row with the envelope out, the reference output. And so this is going into the decay of my envelope. And so it makes it more alive and interesting. So second sound is the metallic noise going straight into LXD to tame the higher frequencies a bit, but you can always use a filter for more control. This is going into, well, straight into scan and pan as well. I don't really have a dedicated big trigger sequencer here, so apart from BinSec, of course. So this is just a division of my clock. I'm using this as prime number division, and this is divided by 3. So it's just striking the LXD, creating this beautiful percussive sound. And I'm using what I'm using to trigger this. So I'm using one gate from multi-stage, the third one, into my second row of the sequence selector. So that's triggering contour. So contour is receiving a trigger. I could use the gate as well. And this is going into the CV input of the LXD to make random, or not really random, but this is because this is 8 step, this is divided by 3, it never really happens the same moment. And so I have control over the shape, over the envelope, and so this creates this sort of little opening of the metallic noise. The metallic noise comes, since it's 60 tune square waves, it kind of sound like a broken chord, which can be very nice. You can really use it as a dubby stab. So that's my 2 percussive sounds, and the pink noise, instead of making yet another percussive sound, it's very low. If you filter it, you can almost make a sort of a kick or add ambience to a kick, but I've just used it as an atmosphere with the Bark filter processor and the Kameniak. So just some low, or rather higher pitched atmosphere noise going into a tone of reverb. And of course the width and the center of the bar filter are modulated by the random sampling. This is a nice little rhythm. We can bring a kick maybe. Okay, let's get musical. Bear with me because this is a fairly complicated patch, as you may be able to see, and this one kind of needs to be described in detail. So I've patched the analog shift register to be sampling my sequence from the voltage multistage at the first input, the CV input. I'm using the reference output, which is just outputting 16th note, my clock basically to the trigger input. So every time the voltage multistage advances, it makes my analog shift register take sample one note and pass it to the next sample and hold. And I'm using 3 of those outputs to send the notes to 3 oscillators that have been tuned to a chord to the best of my abilities. This is something I've never really done. I pretty much never tune anything, and especially not to chord, but hopefully it ends in something nice. So I've used 3 oscillator. The complex oscillator is used as 2 oscillator, completely separate. There's no modulation. So the first one sounds like this. Let's open the VCA. The second one sounds like this. And the third one sounds like this. I don't know why there's some pitch going in there, but oh, maybe that's why. So the third one is Contour 1 by Joe Analog. It's an envelope, but it's also a slew limiter function generator, so it's very, very versatile, and it does track pretty well for an envelope. Actually, it's a very good oscillator. So that's my 3 oscillator. 2 sides of the complex oscillator and Contour 1 mixed into the control voltage processor. I'm using Contour 1 because it tracks way better than the red panel module, and it's capable of basic waveform that works well for a chord, better than Odessa, even if Odessa is capable of chords as well, but whatever. Basically, every time my voltage multistage advances, it sends note data to the analog shift register, which sends the notes to one oscillator, then the next, then the next. So it's sort of a canon, I think it's called. The notes are delayed 1 clock pulse at a time. What do I do now that I have my 3 notes mixed into a mixer? A chord, it's sent to my amplitude and tone controller, which acts as an RPG, and the amplitude and tone controller is opened by a function. One more layer of complexity is that I've not used only the first row of the voltage multistage, but I've used the second rows as well. So I've reduced the steps to 7, so it's actually a 14-step sequence because I'm sending CVA to one input of a sequential switch and CVB to another input of a sequential switch, in that case the A51 by Doppler. I'm sending the first pulse of the voltage multistage to advance the sequential switch. So every time there are 7 steps done, it sends a pulse, and then it goes from one layers of CVA, to the second one, CVB. Yet the gate pattern is always the same. It's just 7 steps. There's just 1 layers of gate here. So the gate pattern is always the same, but it's one time CVA, then the other time CVB. It makes for a bit of a longer sequence. That's one layer of complexity. So let's hear that. I'm just going to plug the clock into the voltage multistage, which is going to make the analog shift register advance, and we hear the result. So function is basically opening the amplitude and tone controller. But I like to have some control over the decay of function. And I don't want to do it by hand. So what I've done is use the random sampling to modulate that. But I've used that in conjunction with the sequence selector. So there's one fluctuating random going into my sequence selector, one quantized random going into another input of the sequence selector, and the result is going into a second channel of quadrupole, and the result is going into function. So my quadrupole is closed actually right now, but if I open it, It's going to send the modulation from the sequence selector every time there's a clock that passes the signal. But once again, I don't want to move that knob with my hand, so I'm using another channel of the quantized random to move that knob for me. Well, actually, this is just a static chord. I forgot to plug the pitch into my sequence for a switch, so now we'll hear the pitch. So it's probably a bit dissonant, like I promised, but here's my chord. And I think it's moving enough that it works. There is, of course, some eventide reverb and El Capiston delay on top. But I think it's a complicated patch, but it's worth the effort. I've never done it, but I think I might do it again. I think the random modulation with the sequence selector really gives life to the patch. Simple, deep, quite groovy. I couldn't have done it with the help of the Ableton tuner, but if you have better musical ears than me, then you'll get nice chords out of your system. Gotta say, the amplitude and tone controller sounds pretty good. I want to do a patch that's very similar to the previous one with the chords, using the ISR to modulate parameters, except this time instead of tuned oscillators, I'm just going to use the complex oscillator as a monophonic voice, and instead of sending my modulation information from the ASR to each and every volt per octave inputs of my oscillator, I'm just going to move parameters around. It's very powerful to just turn some modulation into something that's more like a sequence. So you can turn a low frequency oscillator or random into something that resembles like a Turing machine. A Turing machine is an ASR. My point is that you can turn a sine wave like this into a sort of pattern that's something your ears can grab onto, but something that's a bit more complicated than just a sine wave low frequency oscillator. I have my oscillator droning right now. Let's remove the modulation. That's my complex oscillator in frequency modulation mode. And I'm using the first of the ASR outputs to modulate the timbre, and the second one to modulate my filter. So depending if the value is positive or negative, it's going to close or open my parameters. There's a slight reverb on the multi-delay processor. And so I chose to trigger my ASR with a small trigger from the bean sequencer. You can do simpler things and just use the clock divider or clock or whatever, but I think for this example it works nice with a simple clock, a simple trigger sequence. I think it's nice. And so you can see the beats advancing one by one. Let's complicate this patch a little. I've patched a feedback path going from the multi-delay processor into the noise and filter. I'll use a VCA to go back into my noise and filter, my multi-delay processor. And I'll use one of the sample and hold from the ASR to choose the value which sends the feedback back into the delay. And let's use the last ASR available to do some modulation of the modulation index. Seems like Cortini is among us. Or maybe a cheaper version of Alessandro Cortini. Budget Cortini. Forget the absolute dissonance of some parts. I think you could sample a phrase of this and have some nice track. Let's move the delay. Okay, let's wrap this video about the random sampling with a bit of self-patching. You can influence every part of the random sampling with every part of the random sampling. So let's say I want to use a CV1, the fluctuating random, to modulate a parameter. I can have an influence on the rate with the quantized random. So we will turn my modulation not into a clock modulation, but the rate will fluctuate according with my clock and the quantized random. So it can be interesting. To showcase that, I want to animate a drone. I'll use Odessa as a voice for a change. Here's my drone. Beautiful sounds of Odessa. It's in 5 voice mode, going through the filter 8, which is filtering most of the high end. I'll use a CV1 to influence the wrap parameter and the CV2 to influence density. They both have quite a big impact on the sound. When you're self-patching the module, the stackables can come very handy. And so here's my influence. I'll do the same for the second one. And of course, you can influence back the distribution of your quantized random with the first random. But there's also a filter egg that's staying here unmodulated, so we could use the quantized random, which has its distribution modulated, to modulate our filter rate. So all this interaction creates these beautiful wobbles and craziness. And what if we were trying to send a Morse code to anybody out there, sending a gate into the resonance of the filter rate? Let's send the last quantized random that's not doubled to another parameter of the Odessa. We can try the tension. Ooh, big impact. Maybe I should have tried an attenuator in the path. Oops. Turning into a cacophony now. So you'll get it. This can be quite crazy, but I'm certain that with a bit more care put into the patching, you can definitely be very surprised. I love how the random sampling reacts to the modulation. That makes for a nice soundscape. Anybody needs an intro or outro for an album? Well, with that said, I think it would be the outro of my video. I hope you enjoyed all these complicated patch. I hope you will introduce more random in your life. Your modular life at least. And I hope to see you again. Maybe even on my Patreon page, who knows?